Hey, it's Matthew from Dark Ascent, and today I'll uncover what the deadliest threat on Everest really is. Something changed this 2026 season, not on the mountain, but in the system around it. And that system sent hundreds of climbers into the death zone under terrifying conditions that shouldn't have been allowed. What I discovered from these 5 cases left me absolutely horrified for the future of Everest. So, it was March 3rd, 2026. And the pre-dawn darkness above Camp 4 on the South Col was filled with headlamps, dozens of them, stretching up the triangular face toward the balcony in an unbroken chain of light. It was the first summit push of a season that had already broken records before a single climber touched the top. The Nepalese government had issued over 470 permits for the spring, surpassing the previous high by more than 50. From the research I did, apparently more operators had registered than any prior year, including a wave of budget companies offering packages at a fraction of established rates. When I discovered this, I already had a strange feeling in my gut. Something was wrong. Teams had arrived weeks ahead of schedule, driven by competition and the pressure to get clients acclimatized before the summit windows opened. Base camp on the Khumbu Glacier was packed. Expedition leaders studied the same weather models, circled the same dates, and planned to send clients up the same fixed ropes on the same days. The route had not changed. The bottleneck at the Hillary Step had not widened, but the number of people being funneled toward those choke points had exploded, and weather windows that allowed safe passage lasted only 2 or 3 days. The math was unsustainable, and over the next several weeks, these 5 cases I'm about to show you would prove it. And trust me, each one is worse than the last. Among the climbers departing Camp 4 that morning was Peter van Hees, a 47-year-old Belgian who had spent most of his career in pharmaceutical sales, and the last 4 years redefining himself through mountaineering. He had summited Kilimanjaro and Elbrus on guided trips and considered Everest the natural next step. He signed with a budget operator in Kathmandu for roughly $35,000, well below established rates. The savings came from somewhere: fewer support staff, less oxygen margin, and an expedition structure built to move clients through the system rather than evaluate whether they belonged in it. His Sherpa was Jangbu Norkong, early 30s, 4 Everest summits. Quiet, reliable, the kind of guide who said little but missed nothing. He had noticed the size of the departing group that night. More headlamps than he had seen on any previous summit push. More bodies on the same fixed ropes. More oxygen being consumed in the same narrow corridor above 26,000 feet. The same silent but deadly killers I and regular viewers of this channel know all too well. Peter moved well through the early hours. His pace was steady, his crampon placements adequate on the hard snow of the triangular face. The trouble began above the balcony at 27,600 feet, where the route narrowed and the line of climbers ahead slowed to a crawl. A bottleneck had formed near the south summit, teams queuing on a narrow section of fixed rope where only one climber could move at a time. And if you've watched my other videos on overcrowding and bottlenecks, you already know what kind of brutal incidents it could cause. The line stopped and Peter stood still for over an hour. The wind chill was approximately minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and his oxygen hissed steadily through the regulator at a rate that did not care whether he was climbing or standing. Jangbu watched the gauge and ran the math. At current burn, they did not have enough to summit and return safely. He recommended they turn around. Peter refused. He had spent his savings on this expedition. He had told his colleagues, his family, his friends, he would conquer Everest at all costs, a seemingly common situation I've showcased on this channel plenty of times. Turning around was not something he had prepared for, and at 27,600 feet, the idea of descending felt worse than the risk of continuing. Jangbu repeated the recommendation. Peter pushed forward when the line moved. He reached the summit late in the morning, hours behind schedule. He spent less than 10 minutes before beginning his descent. His oxygen dropped to critical levels near the south summit. His coordination failed. Steps that had been deliberate became clumsy. Crampon points scraping rather than biting. He sat down on the fixed ropes at approximately 28,600 feet and did not stand again. Jangbu reached him within seconds but could not move him alone. Other descending climbers passed without stopping. They had their own oxygen running to zero. Peter van Hees was found dead the following morning in the same seated position with his bottle empty. Honestly, I get it. It is their choice, and it admittedly might seem like a stupid decision to go mountain climbing, especially taking on Everest. But I can't help but feel sad every time I cover a story like this, even if they were at fault. His expedition company attributed the death to altitude sickness. Teams on the mountain that day knew the real cause: an hour-long traffic jam in the death zone that drained his only margin for survival. His death was treated as isolated, one climber who pushed too far. But within days, the same route would produce the same delays, the same oxygen math, and a far worse outcome. What happened during the next story revealed that the problem was not one man's decision, it was the mountain itself, or rather, what had been done to it. It was March 6th, 2026, and the second summit window had opened, and the traffic was even worse here. Among the climbers departing Camp 4 that night were Ryan and Kara Mercer, both 32, married, from Denver. She ran ultramarathons. He had been a collegiate swimmer. They had trained for 2 years and treated Everest as a shared milestone, worth the $90,000 they had spent between them. Their fitness exceeded most clients on the mountain, but neither had been above 23,500 feet before Camp 4, and Everest above the South Col was a different world. Their Sherpa was Chongba Rinji, late 30s, 6 Everest summits, known for his directness with clients who didn't want to hear what he had to say, something most Sherpas should be doing honestly, with how stupid some of the climbers I've covered can be. He had seen the departing traffic, over 100 climbers from multiple expeditions leaving within the same 2-hour window, and radioed his concern. He was told to proceed anyways. The couple climbed well through the darkness. The problems began above the south summit at roughly 28,500 feet, where the route funneled toward the Hillary Step, where, like in the other stories I've covered, the line had stopped entirely again. Climbers ascending and descending on the same fixed rope had created gridlock on a ridge narrow enough that a stumble meant a fall of thousands of feet. Now, if you weren't already scared with how fatal bottlenecks and overcrowding can be, you haven't even seen half of it. Stay with me. It's going to get worse from here on. They stood in that line for nearly 2 hours. Oxygen burned steadily. Wind drove across the exposed ridge. Chongba monitored the gauges and told them directly they would need to turn around now or they would not have enough oxygen to descend safely. Ryan agreed, but Kara was not in the same boat. Over $90,000 combined. 2 years of training. She could see the summit. She was not turning around, but Ryan would not leave without her. And so they pushed on together, and my heart breaks for Ryan. He clearly sensed something was wrong, and going any further would be dangerous, yet he could not leave the love of his life alone. They summited in the early afternoon, far later than any safe schedule allowed. On descent, Kara's coordination began failing above the south summit. Steps became uneven, her responses delayed by seconds that stretched longer as hypoxia deepened. Ryan stayed beside her, matching her pace, refusing to descend faster. Chongba split his own oxygen supply to keep her conscious. Night fell. They were still above 27,000 feet. The temperature dropped. The wind increased. Kara's movements suddenly became mechanical, then stopped entirely. Chongba attempted to revive her, adjusting oxygen, speaking through the mask, but she did not respond. She died on the fixed ropes after dark, with her husband beside her. Ryan Mercer and Chongba Rinji reached Camp 4 at dawn. Ryan's hands were destroyed. Severe frostbite that later cost him 3 fingers. But what tore at my soul even more was that he had to descend, leaving behind his beloved wife all alone, cold and dead. Chongba, who had spent over 20 hours above 27,000 feet, suffered frostbite to both feet, requiring a partial amputation of several toes. At 38, his guiding career was over, ended not by his own mistake, but by a system that sent too many people into a space too small to hold them. 2 summit windows, 2 disasters, both produced by the same conditions. Too many climbers, too little room, and decisions made under pressure that would never survive scrutiny at sea level. But those cases involved people who at least understood the risks. The next case would show what happened when someone with almost no experience was pushed into the death zone by a system that valued his money more than his life. Hey, quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth coverage matters to you, subscribing and leaving a like helps support the channel, make more videos like this. Now let's get back to the mountain. It was March 8th, 2026, and the next summit window was building. At Camp 3 on the Lhotse face, climbers moved in slow lines up blue ice that held between 40 and 50 degrees. Among them, barely moving, requiring support from both sides, was Tariq al-Rashid. He was 54, Emirati, and the founder of a construction empire across the Gulf. He was not a climber. One guided trek in Nepal and a guided Kilimanjaro summit, both with full porter support, no technical skill required. He had never used crampons on steep ice or spent a night above 20,000 feet. What he had was money, and on Everest in 2026, that was increasingly the only qualification that mattered. And well, it might seem obvious, but believe me, from the stories I've covered and researched, money in climbing never ends well. He had hired a premium operator for well over $100,000, a dedicated 2 Sherpa team, and extra oxygen. He had been posting about the climb on social media for months. The narrative demanded a summit. His lead Sherpa was Thendu Galzin, early 40s, 8 Everest summits. His second was Furba Concha, late 20s, 2 summits, strong but less experienced with difficult clients. At Camp 3, Thendu radioed the expedition leader and recommended the client not continue. Too slow, too exhausted, too unskilled. The leader hesitated. Tariq had paid the highest fee of the season. He had connections that could generate future bookings. He had announced on social media he would summit within days. The leader overrode the recommendation, something that infuriated me to my core when I read it. They got Tariq to Camp 4. He could barely function, could not prepare equipment, struggled to eat. On summit night, the team departed over an hour late. They fell behind immediately. The ascent took more than 14 hours. Every step above 27,000 feet required rest. The Sherpas essentially guided his body upward, positioning his feet, adjusting his ascender, managing his oxygen, carrying everything he could not. They reached the summit in the early afternoon, long after most teams had descended. The Sherpas were destroyed, and I actually shed a tear when I read this, especially knowing what happens next. Most of the Sherpas I've read up on are truly kind and have the client's best interest in mind. That's why this next part will be hard to read, but let's continue. On descent, Tariq's legs gave out above the balcony. He sat down and could not stand. Thendu and Furba Concha attempted to drag him down the fixed ropes, bearing his weight between them on terrain steep enough that a misstep could send all 3 falling. During the effort, Furba Concha's knee buckled under the combined load on a section of hard ice, ligaments tearing. He collapsed beside the client he was trying to save. Tariq stopped responding, and his breathing became irregular, then shallow, then quiet. And then he died near the balcony in the early evening at approximately 27,500 feet. Thendu and the injured Furba Concha descended to Camp 4 in darkness, one supporting the other on a leg that could no longer bear full weight. The expedition company stated that all safety protocols were followed. The Sherpa community knew otherwise. Furba Concha's knee required surgery in Kathmandu. The damage ended his career at 28. He had been injured trying to save a man the system placed on Everest because of greed. And truthfully, being angry and sad is all I can do through a screen. But I'll never forget Furba's heroic act, and I hope you don't too. 3 cases, 3 patterns: overcrowding, commercial pressure, and experience treated as someone else's problem. A system that prioritized revenue and left Sherpas to carry the consequences. But everything so far had involved individuals or small groups. What came next involved dozens of climbers trapped on the same stretch of rope at the same time. And it proved that the warnings about the 2026 season had been accurate all along. It was March 12th, 2026, and another summit window had arrived. The strongest forecast of the season, but also possibly the last. Every team that had not yet summited was going. Marcus Hale was a British guide in his early 40s, 11 Himalayan expedition, 5 Everest summits, 3 clients, 2 Sherpas. Lakpa Dendi, mid-30s with 5 summits, and Pasang Tendu, late 20s with 3. On the South Col, Marcus counted over 130 climbers preparing to depart within the same 2-hour window. He radioed his operator about the congestion. He was told to proceed. The team departed at midnight. The line stretched from the Col to the balcony without a gap, and at approximately 27,800 feet, the line stopped completely, something that I could see coming again. A climber from a budget expedition had collapsed on the fixed rope, unconscious, clipped in, blocking the only route. Moving him required unclipping his safety line on terrain, where an unsecured body would slide thousands of feet. Over 30 climbers stacked below, motionless in the death zone, oxygen ticking downward. And thinking about it, the stories I'm covering are only the confirmed ones I found while researching. Imagine the amount of equally horrifying and brutal tragedies lost to the mountain we'll never know about. 30 minutes stuck, and then an hour, and then 90 minutes. And it might seem cruel, but the collapsed climber was finally moved to the side. He died there, and the line resumed past his body. This was simply how things go in situations like this, and I get it. 90 minutes at 27,500 feet had consumed the oxygen dozens needed for descent. Marcus made the call, turn around. 2 of 3 clients refused. One was on his 3rd Everest attempt. The other had promised her family. Marcus descended with the 3rd client and both Sherpas. The 2 remaining clients continued. Both summited late and neither returned. According to what I found, other climbers saw the first client fell on the traverse below the south summit, missed a step and slid off the fixed rope. The second became disoriented and wide out and wandered off route, found dead the next day, several hundred feet from the fixed lines. The budget expedition lost 2 as well. The collapsed climber, plus another client who ran out of oxygen during the standstill. 4 dead from a single push. Marcus later called it the worst night of his career, and I definitely agree. But stay with me. There's another climb far worse that I think truly showcases how bad the situation on Everest has become. 4 summit windows, 11 dead, a pattern no longer deniable. But the season was not over. One more weather window remained, and what happened during that final push would become the defining disaster of the 2026 season. A catastrophe so tied to overcrowding and systemic failure that it forced the climbing world to confront what the mountain had become. It was March 14th, 2026. Every team that had not yet summited made their push on the same night. Among them was a commercial expedition led by a Nepali operator with a strong reputation. Their lead Sherpa was Furba Thendup, late 30s, 9 Everest summits, one of the most respected high-altitude guides in the Khumbu. He had spent 15 years on the mountain and had never lost a client. His team included 5 clients. One was Alison Brewer, 37, a Canadian nurse from Calgary who had trained for 3 years and saved for 5. She was competent, strong cardiovascular fitness, solid acclimatization, no signs of altitude illness, not elite, but not unqualified. She had come to Everest knowing the risks and accepting them, something that I can wholeheartedly respect. Furba stood outside his tent on the South Col and counted headlamps on the route above. He stopped counting after 150. He had never seen anything like it. He radioed his expedition leader and recommended delaying departure by 2 hours to let the worst traffic pass, and the leader agreed. From what I can find, the delay placed them behind the main crowd, but did not solve the problem. The bottleneck was above them, not behind. By the time Furba's team reached the balcony at dawn, the line above was barely moving. Climbers were visible in an unbroken chain all the way to the south summit. 100 bodies on fixed ropes, each one consuming oxygen, calculated for movement, not standstill. Above the south summit, the line at the Hillary step had ground to a complete halt. Climbers stacked on the narrow ridge, exposed to wind, unable to move forward, unable to easily retreat. Furba's team reached the queue and stopped. They stood still for over 2 hours at approximately 28,600 feet. 2 hours of burning oxygen. 2 hours of heat bleeding from their bodies into wind that carried it away faster than their metabolisms could replace it. Furba watched his clients. 2 were deteriorating visibly. One swaying on his feet, the other had stopped responding to questions. And honestly, just imagining even being in the Sherpa's situation shakes me to my core. Alison was holding steady, but her oxygen gauge was dropping faster than the timeline allowed. Furba radioed the expedition leader and recommended turning the entire team around immediately. The leader hesitated. Clients had paid. Clients were begging to continue. The summit was visible above them. But Furba did not wait for the answer. He began turning the team around himself. And yeah, this really cements it for me, that Sherpas really are elite athletes, but are also one of the kindest people out there. But 2 hours of standing still at 28,600 feet had already caused damage that descent could not reverse. The 2 weakest clients began collapsing on the way down. The first stopped moving above the south summit and could not be revived. He died on the fixed ropes before the team had descended 500 feet. The second made it further, but lost consciousness below 28,000 feet. Sherpas from another expedition attempted to help, but there was nothing left to save. He died where he fell. Other climbers were also failing around them. The entire upper section of the mountain was becoming a slow-motion crisis. Fixed ropes were jammed with people trying to descend. Bodies were passed on the route. Climbers who had sat down and never stood again, their outlines already dusted with blown snow. Reading this part, where everything all around them was just in constant chaos, was so terrifying, I had to take a breather and stop for a second. I can only imagine what it's like when you're there in person. But Alison began deteriorating below the south summit. Her speech became confused, answers arriving seconds late and disconnected from the questions. Her steps turned mechanical. the movement of someone whose conscious mind was no longer fully directing her body. Furba stayed at her side, adjusting her oxygen, placing her feet, talking her down step by step through terrain that required constant focus. Her condition worsened with each 100 feet of descent. She began pulling at her gloves, tugging them off with the dull, repetitive insistence of someone whose brain was misfiring, interpreting the cold as heat. Paradoxical undressing, a hallmark of terminal hypothermia and cerebral edema. Furba replaced them. She removed them again. Her oxygen ran out. Furba removed his own mask and fitted his bottle onto her regulator. She improved briefly. A few steps, a flicker of clarity that disappeared like a match struck in wind. She sat down on the fixed rope at approximately 27,200 feet and looked at Furba without recognition. Her eyes were open, but the person behind them had retreated somewhere the thin air could not reach. I thought he couldn't surprise me anymore, but then Furba lifted her over his shoulder and descended, carrying her weight without supplemental oxygen at an altitude where every breath delivered a fraction of what his cells required. He carried her for roughly 200 vertical feet before his legs gave out. His vision darkened. His lungs produced a wet, rattling sound with each breath that had not been there before. He lowered her to the ice and knelt beside her. She was no longer breathing. Furba Thendup stayed beside Allison Brewer on the fixed ropes until another Sherpa team found them and forced him to descend. He reached Camp 4 after dark, unable to speak, his breathing shallow and labored. And wow, that was one chaotic ride. Even just reading it, I honestly am just speechless. 7 climbers died that day across multiple expeditions. The 2026 season's death toll reached 18, the highest in years. Investigations were launched by Nepalese authorities. Permit reform was discussed publicly for the first time with genuine urgency. Expedition companies issued statements, but nothing was resolved. And honestly, this part was hard to write, and I'm happy Furba Thendup survived. But examinations in Kathmandu revealed permanent lung damage from prolonged exposure above 27,000 feet without supplemental oxygen. Doctors told him he could not return to extreme altitude. After 9 summits and 15 years of guiding, his career was over, ended on a night when he gave his oxygen to a client the system had placed in a line that should never have existed. The mountain's appearance itself did not change in 2026. Everest is the same height it has always been. The same ice, the same ridges, the same thin air that has killed climbers for over a century. What changed was everything around it. More permits, more operators, more money, more clients who had no business being above 26,000 feet, and a route to the summit that could not expand to hold the demand being forced through it. The deaths that season were not caused by Everest. They were caused by what Everest had been turned into. An overcrowded funnel where one narrow weather window and one traffic jam could turn a summit push into a mass casualty event. And nothing suggested the next season would be any different, but I really hope the situation improves. This was one of the hardest videos I've ever had to make.